I entered my millionaire son's cafe in disguise. What I heard him say made me change the $8 million inheritance. The words cut through my heart like broken glass. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor Whitman. I'm 73 years old, and until recently, I lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Queens, New York. The morning air carried the scent of car exhaust and street vendor coffee through my thin windows. Every day, I'd wake up at 5:30, my arthritic hands folding towels that had seen better decades, preparing meals that grew cold while I waited for phone calls that never came. The silence in my apartment felt heavier than the city noise outside. I'd sit at my small kitchen table staring at framed photographs of my son Michael from when he was young. Back then, his eyes sparkled with genuine love when he looked at me. Now, those same eyes had grown cold, distant, calculating. The smell of coffee always reminded me of him, but instead of warmth, it brought a hollow ache that settled deep in my chest. Last Tuesday, I sent Michael a text message. It was simple, really. Just asking if I could visit for his 38th birthday. I typed it 3 times before sending, my fingers trembling over each word. Hi, honey. Would love to celebrate your birthday with you. Love, Mom. I watched those 3 dots appear and disappear for what felt like hours. Then nothing. Complete silence. Not even a courtesy reply. I clutched the newspaper clipping I'd saved about his new cafe in Manhattan. Rising entrepreneur opens luxury coffee house. The headline read. The article mentioned his net worth, his innovative approach, his vision for expanding across the city. It never mentioned his mother. Never mentioned the woman who worked 3 jobs to put him through business school. Never mentioned the sacrifices that built his foundation. I imagined walking into that cafe, seeing his face light up with surprise and joy. I pictured him introducing me to his employees, his customers, with pride in his voice. This is my mother, Eleanor. She's the reason I'm here today. But that was just a fantasy, a cruel dream that kept me awake at night. The invitation to his cafe's grand opening sat on my dresser for weeks. Gold-embossed letters on cream paper, elegant and expensive. At the bottom, in small print, it said, "By invitation only." I wasn't on the guest list. My own son's celebration, and I wasn't invited. The paper felt cold between my fingers as I read it over and over, hoping the words would change. When I think back to Michael's childhood, the memories feel like watching someone else's life through a fogged window. After his father abandoned us when Michael was 8, I became everything to him. Mother, father, provider, protector. I worked as a night shift nurse, a weekend housekeeper, and tutored neighborhood kids for extra money. My hands were always cracked from cleaning solutions, my feet swollen from standing 14-hour shifts. Michael had severe asthma as a child. I remember those terrifying nights when his breathing would become shallow and ragged. I'd carry him to the emergency room, my heart pounding as doctors rushed him into treatment rooms. During one particularly bad episode, the medical bills exceeded my insurance coverage by thousands of dollars. I pawned my grandmother's pearl necklace, the only valuable thing I owned, to pay for his medication. It's not enough, Mom, he told me when I tried to help with his college applications. He was 17 then, already taller than me, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. The other kids have parents who can write bigger checks. You're holding me back. The words hit me like physical blows. I stood there in our tiny kitchen, still wearing my nursing uniform after a double shift, and felt something crack inside my chest. But I kept giving. When he graduated business school with honors, I threw him a party in our cramped apartment. I made his favorite cake from scratch, invited everyone we knew. He showed up 2 hours late, stayed for 20 minutes, then left to meet friends at some upscale restaurant I couldn't afford. The cake sat untouched on the table while I cleaned up alone. He doesn't appreciate anything I do, I confided to my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. I give and give, but it's never enough. She patted my shoulder with understanding eyes. But what could she say? We both knew the truth hanging in the air between us. The pattern continued through his 20s. Cold comments about my outdated clothes at family gatherings, criticism of my apartment when his business colleagues visited, eye rolls when I shared stories from my childhood or offered advice about his career. I learned to stay quiet, to make myself smaller, hoping that somehow my silence would earn his affection. Christmas became the hardest time. I'd spend weeks planning the perfect gifts, cooking his favorite meals, decorating my apartment until it looked like a magazine photo. One year, he forgot my name when introducing me to his girlfriend. This is Eleanor, he said, as if I were a distant acquaintance instead of the woman who raised him single-handedly. I excused myself to the bathroom and cried silently for 10 minutes before returning with a smile. Slowly, I began questioning everything. Was I just a convenient stepping stone for his success? Someone to clean up his messes when things went wrong, but invisible when life was good? The doubt ate at me like acid, corroding my self-worth one criticism at a time. I started believing maybe I really wasn't good enough for the successful man my son had become. The phone calls became less frequent. The visits stopped altogether. My birthdays passed unnoticed while I continued remembering every milestone in his life. Last spring, when I was hospitalized with pneumonia, I took a selfie from my hospital bed and sent it to him. "In the hospital, honey. Nothing serious, but would love to hear from you." The message showed as read. No response came. 3 days later, I called him directly. His assistant answered, professional and polite. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitman is in meetings all day. Can I take a message?" I hung up without leaving one. My own son couldn't spare 2 minutes to check on his hospitalized mother. That night, lying in that sterile hospital bed, listening to machines beep around me, I faced a truth I'd been avoiding for years. Michael didn't want me in his life. I wasn't a beloved mother. I was an obligation he resented, a reminder of a past he wanted to forget. The realization hurt worse than the pneumonia burning in my lungs. Mrs. Rodriguez visited me in the hospital, bringing homemade soup and genuine concern. "How are you feeling, mija?" she asked, using the Spanish endearment that made me feel more cared for than I had in months. We talked for hours about everything except Michael. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen by another human being. When I was discharged, Mrs. Rodriguez helped me up the stairs to my apartment. As we reached my door, she mentioned something casually that stopped me cold. "Your son's Café, the fancy one in Manhattan? My cousin works construction there, says they're having money troubles, big money troubles, something about $2 million in debt." I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. Michael's $1 million success story, his financial independence, his reason for not needing his old-fashioned mother. It was all built on borrowed money and desperate hope. The betrayal cut deeper than his coldness ever had. Not only had he pushed me away, but he'd done it while his entire empire was crumbling. That evening, I sat by my bedroom window looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The city lights blurred through my tears as the full weight of my situation crashed over me. I wasn't just neglected. I had been used as an emotional scapegoat while my son chased a fragile dream that was already falling apart. The successful businessman who was too important for his mother was drowning in debt and lies. I picked up Michael's favorite mug from my nightstand. A blue ceramic piece he'd given me years ago with "World's Best Mom" printed on the side. My hand started shaking, and suddenly the mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through my empty apartment like a gunshot. I stared at the broken pieces and saw my relationship with my son reflected in every sharp fragment. For hours, I sat on my bedroom floor crying, not the quiet, polite tears I'd trained myself to shed in private, but deep, body-shaking sobs that came from decades of suppressed pain. The grief poured out of me like water from a broken dam. Every ignored birthday, every canceled visit, every cold shoulder and cutting comment, it all rushed out at once. But somewhere in that darkness, a small voice emerged from deep inside me. A voice I hadn't heard in years whispered, "Maybe it's okay to say no." The thought terrified me. Saying no to Michael meant risking the complete loss of our relationship. But as I sat surrounded by the broken pieces of that mug, I realized our relationship was already broken. I had just been too afraid to see it. The fear of loneliness had controlled me for so long. The desperate need to maintain some connection with my son, even if it was toxic and one-sided, had kept me trapped in a cycle of giving without receiving. But that night, staring at those mug fragments, I felt something shift. The yearning for dignity burned stronger than my fear of abandonment. I spent the rest of the night boxing away every photograph of Michael and me together. Wedding pictures, graduation photos, childhood memories. They all went into storage boxes that I stacked in my closet. Standing in front of my bedroom mirror afterward, I looked at the woman who had lost herself in the desperate need for her son's approval. My reflection showed someone I barely recognized, hollow-eyed, stooped-shouldered, defeated. But in that moment of recognition came a spark of the woman I used to be, the strong, single mother who had worked multiple jobs and overcome every obstacle, the woman who had raised a successful son despite impossible odds. She was still in there, buried under years of emotional abuse and manipulation, but she was fighting to resurface. When Michael called 3 days later asking for financial help with his cafe's rent, I felt the familiar urge to say yes, to rush to his rescue like I always had. His voice carried that charming tone he used when he needed something, suddenly warm and loving again. "Mom, I know we haven't talked much lately, but I really need your help. Just this once. Just this once." I'd heard those words countless times before. Just this once when he needed college tuition. Just this once when he needed startup capital for his first business venture. Just this once when he needed help with his wedding expenses. Each just this once had cost me thousands I couldn't afford and bought me nothing but deeper invisibility. "Michael," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I can't help you this time." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had returned to that cold, distant tone I knew so well. "I should have known I couldn't count on you when it matters," he said. "You've always been selfish." The accusation stung, but for the first time, I didn't rush to defend myself or apologize. I simply said, "I love you, son, but I won't be treated this way anymore," and hung up. My hands trembled as I set down the phone, but underneath the fear was something I hadn't felt in years: pride. I had stood up for myself. I had said no to my own child and survived the conversation. The world hadn't ended. The apartment walls hadn't collapsed. I was still breathing, still standing, still whole. Instead of attending Michael's Thanksgiving dinner that year, another command performance where I'd be ignored while serving his guests, I took my first day off in decades. I walked through Flushing Meadows Park in Queens, listening to the rustle of autumn leaves beneath my feet. The air smelled crisp and clean, carrying the promise of winter and the hope of renewal. I found an empty bench overlooking the lake and sat there for hours, watching families enjoy their holiday together. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to get somewhere else, wasn't worried about disappointing someone with my presence or absence. The peace I felt sitting on that bench was deeper than any satisfaction I'd ever gotten from Michael's rare moments of approval. That night, I cooked a small turkey breast just for myself. I set my tiny table with my good china, lit a candle, and ate in comfortable solitude. No one criticized my cooking or complained about my conversation. No one checked their phone while I spoke or made excuses to leave early. For the first time in years, I enjoyed Thanksgiving dinner. I slept deeply that night, without the nightmares that had plagued me for months. No dreams of Michael's disappointment or visions of dying alone and forgotten, just peaceful, restorative sleep. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through my bedroom windows, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. The following Monday, I called the lawyer Mrs. Rodriguez had recommended, a kind woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in elder law. Her office in downtown Flushing was small but comfortable, filled with plants and family photos that spoke of a life lived with intention and love. "Mrs. Whitman," Patricia said after I'd explained my situation, "you have every right to protect your assets and your emotional well-being. The fact that your son is asking you for money while treating you poorly suggests you might need some legal boundaries." We spent 2 hours reviewing my finances and discussing my options. I learned that the modest investments my late husband had left me, combined with my savings from years of frugal living, had grown to just over $8 million. Money I'd never touched because I'd been too afraid of being seen as wasteful or irresponsible by my son. "This is your money," Patricia reminded me. "You earned it through your work and wise saving. You get to decide how it's used." The concept felt foreign after decades of seeking Michael's approval for every financial decision, but it also felt liberating. 3 months later, my daughter Nancy arranged a family brunch at Michael's Manhattan apartment. Nancy was 2 years older than Michael, a successful doctor who had maintained a distant but cordial relationship with me over the years. Unlike her brother, she never asked for money, but she also never defended me from his treatment. I arrived at Michael's apartment building in Midtown, the doorman's polite nod a stark contrast to the cold reception I expected upstairs. The apartment was everything I'd imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, modern furniture that cost more than I'd made in a year as a nurse, artwork that spoke of wealth and sophisticated taste. Michael and Nancy were already seated at his dining table, their conversation stopping abruptly when I entered. Nancy smiled and kissed my cheek, but her greeting felt rehearsed. Michael nodded in my direction without getting up, his attention already returning to his phone. "Mom," Nancy began, her voice carrying the diplomatic tone she used in difficult medical situations. "We wanted to talk to you about Thanksgiving. Michael feels like you were trying to punish him by not coming." I looked at my son, waiting for him to speak for himself, but he continued scrolling through his phone as if I weren't there. The familiar pattern was starting again. Nancy as intermediary, Michael as the wounded party, and me as the unreasonable mother who needed to be managed. "I wasn't trying to punish anyone," I said quietly. "I was taking care of myself for once." The honesty in my voice seemed to surprise them both. Nancy's diplomatic smile faltered, and Michael finally looked up from his phone. "Taking care of yourself?" Michael's voice carried that mocking tone I remembered from his teenage years. "By abandoning your family when we needed you?" The accusation was so absurd it almost made me laugh. When had either of them ever needed me for anything other than money or free labor? I reached into my purse and pulled out an old photograph I'd brought, the three of us at Michael's college graduation. In the picture, I was beaming with pride, my arms around both my children, believing I was looking at our bright future together. Nancy looked uncomfortable but dutiful. Michael was already looking away from the camera, his attention elsewhere even in that moment of celebration. Slowly, deliberately, I tore the photograph in half, then in quarters. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo through Michael's expensive apartment. Both my children stared at me in shock, as if their predictable mother had suddenly become a stranger. "I will no longer buy love," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I will no longer accept crumbs of affection in exchange for my dignity. I will no longer allow my own children to treat me like an embarrassment they have to tolerate." The words came from a place of strength I'd forgotten I possessed. Nancy reached across the table as if to touch my hand, but I pulled back. "Mom, you're being dramatic. We never meant to hurt you." Her voice carried the same dismissive tone they'd both used my entire adult life, the tone that said my feelings weren't valid, my pain wasn't real. "But you did hurt me," I replied. "Every ignored phone call, every canceled visit, every time you made me feel like loving you was a privilege I had to earn. I've spent decades trying to be good enough for my own children, and I'm done." Michael finally put down his phone, his businessman's mask slipping to reveal genuine surprise. "Mom, you're overreacting. So what if we've been busy? You should understand that success requires sacrifice." "Yes," I said, standing up from the table. "It does. And I've been sacrificing my self-respect for your success long enough." The strength in my own voice surprised me. This wasn't the broken woman who had cried herself to sleep for months. This was someone new, someone who had remembered her own worth. The room fell completely silent. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see people walking through Central Park, living their lives, pursuing their own happiness. For the first time in years, I wanted to be one of those people. I wanted to walk out of this apartment and into my own life. "Respect me or lose me," I said, picking up my purse. "Those are your choices." I walked toward the door without looking back, my heart pounding but my steps steady. Behind me, I heard Nancy calling my name, but I didn't turn around. The woman who would have apologized and begged for forgiveness was gone. For weeks after that confrontation, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of constantly seeking approval from people who would never give it had been lifted from my shoulders. I started each day with coffee and newspaper on my fire escape, watching the neighborhood wake up around me. Mrs. Rodriguez and I began taking evening walks together, sharing stories and laughter without any hidden agendas. I thought the hardest part was over. I believed that setting boundaries with my children would be the end of the story, that we would either reconcile respectfully or I would continue building my new life in peace. I was naive to think my journey toward self-respect would be that simple. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March. Nancy's voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "Mom, you need to know what Michael has been saying about you." My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to listen. "He's been telling people that you're having some kind of mental breakdown. He says you've become bitter and vindictive, that you're trying to sabotage his business out of jealousy." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. After everything I'd endured, after finally finding the courage to stand up for myself, my son was now publicly painting me as the villain in our story. The woman who had sacrificed everything for his success was being portrayed as the reason for his failure. "There's more," Nancy continued reluctantly. "He's posted something on social media. Mom, it's bad." She read me the post, her voice breaking with each word. Michael had written a long, eloquent paragraph about the challenges of caring for an elderly parent with mental health issues. He painted himself as the long-suffering son, trying to help a mother who had become manipulative and unstable. The post had hundreds of likes and dozens of comments offering support for Michael's difficult situation. People I'd known for years, neighbors and family friends, were reading lies about my mental state and believing them. The humiliation felt worse than anything Michael had ever done to me directly. But here's what surprised me. After the initial shock wore off, instead of crumbling under this public betrayal, instead of rushing to defend myself or beg forgiveness, I felt a calm clarity wash over me. This was who my son really was. This was the man I had raised and protected and supported through everything. I didn't call Michael to scream at him. I didn't post my own social media response or try to correct the narrative. I simply sat in my apartment, drinking tea and watching the sunset paint my walls golden, and felt grateful. Grateful that I finally knew the truth without any doubt. Grateful that I had already begun the process of freeing myself from his manipulation. The final test came a week later. I was grocery shopping in my neighborhood when I ran into Margaret Simpson, an old family friend who had known Michael since he was a child. Her face was full of sympathy and concern as she approached me in the produce section. "Eleanor," she said softly, "I saw Michael's post. I'm so sorry you're going through this difficult time. Is there anything I can do to help?" Her kindness was genuine, but it was based on lies my son had told about me. The old me would have been devastated, would have spent hours explaining and defending myself. Instead, I smiled and said, "Thank you for your concern, Margaret, but I'm doing better than I have in years." Her confusion was visible, but I didn't elaborate. I finished my shopping and went home, feeling sorry for Michael rather than angry at him. He was so desperate to avoid responsibility for his failures that he was willing to destroy his own mother's reputation. That kind of desperation was its own punishment. That night, I made a decision that would have been impossible just months earlier. I called Patricia Chen and asked her to draw up papers changing my will entirely. The $8 million I'd been planning to leave to my children would instead go to organizations that actually cared about vulnerable people, local food banks, literacy programs, and a scholarship fund for single mothers pursuing nursing degrees. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Whitman?" Patricia asked gently. "This is a significant decision. You might want to take some time to think about it." But I had never been more certain of anything in my life. My children had made their choices about our relationship. Now I was making mine about my legacy. Spring arrived in New York with unusual warmth and earlier than expected. The trees in Flushing Meadows Park burst into bloom, filling the air with the scent of cherry blossoms and new beginnings. Mrs. Rodriguez and I decided to start a community garden project in our neighborhood, converting an unused lot into a place where families could grow vegetables and flowers together. The first day of the garden project, I wore a bright yellow sundress I'd bought for myself The first new clothes I'd purchased in years. The color made me feel alive and visible in a way that had nothing to do with other people's approval. My hands, which had spent so many years serving others, were finally being used for something that brought me joy. "Señora Eleanor," called out Sophia, Mrs. Rodriguez's 8-year-old granddaughter, "can you help me plant the tomatoes?" Her small face was serious with concentration as she carefully placed seeds in the soil. Working beside her, teaching her how to nurture something into growth, I felt a peace I'd never experienced with my own children. The garden project attracted people from all over our neighborhood. Families from Ecuador, Bangladesh, Korea, and Puerto Rico worked side by side, sharing techniques and stories and laughter. I found myself at the center of this community, not because I was trying to earn anyone's love, but because I had genuine affection to offer and the wisdom that comes from surviving heartbreak. One afternoon, as I was watering the lettuce seedlings, Sophia ran up to me and wrapped her small arms around my waist in an unexpected hug. "I love you, Abuela Eleanor," she said, using the Spanish word for grandmother that made my heart soar. In that moment, surrounded by growing things and genuine affection, I realized I had found the family I'd been seeking my entire life. I joined a jazz dance class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was busy serving everyone else's needs. The instructor, a vibrant woman named Carmen, who had to be at least my age, welcomed me with enthusiasm. "Honey," she said after my first class, "you've got rhythm in your soul. We're going to have so much fun together." My body, which had felt old and tired for so long, began to remember how to move with joy. The music filled spaces inside me that had been empty for years. I bought dance shoes and scarves that flowed when I moved. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I transformed from the invisible mother into a woman who existed purely for her own pleasure. The changes were visible to everyone around me. Mrs. Rodriguez commented on how I stood straighter, smiled more often, laughed at things that would have made me cry months earlier. "You look like yourself again, mija," she said one evening as we watched the sunset from our garden. "Like the woman you were meant to be." 6 months after I changed my will, I received an unexpected visitor. Nancy stood at my door on a Saturday morning, looking older than her 40 years, her face drawn with worry and exhaustion. "Mom," she said quietly, "we need to talk." I invited her in and made tea, noting how she looked around my apartment with new eyes. The photos of her and Michael were gone, replaced with pictures from the community garden and my dance class. Fresh flowers from our garden brightened every room. The space felt like home in a way it never had before. "Michael's business is failing," Nancy said without preamble. "The cafe is closing. He's filing for bankruptcy." She paused, studying my face for a reaction. "He wants to know if you would reconsider helping him. He says he's learned his lesson about treating family with respect." I set down my teacup and looked at my daughter with compassion but no guilt. "Nancy, your brother and I both had to learn difficult lessons this year. Mine was about self-respect. His was about consequences. I won't interfere with either lesson." Nancy's eyes filled with tears. "But Mom, he's your son. Family is supposed to forgive and help each other." The plea in her voice reminded me of my own desperate attempts to maintain connection at any cost. "You're right," I said gently. "Family should help each other. Family should also treat each other with basic kindness and respect. Michael made his choices about our relationship. I've made mine about my boundaries." The words came easily now, without the internal struggle that had once accompanied any decision to put myself first. Nancy left that afternoon looking defeated, but I felt no guilt about her disappointment. For the first time in my life, I was living according to my own values rather than trying to meet everyone else's expectations. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying and absolutely necessary. As autumn returned to New York, bringing another year full circle, I received a letter that made me laugh out loud. It was from a law firm representing Michael, threatening legal action if I didn't reinstate him as my heir. The letter was full of legal language about family obligations and mental competency evaluations. The man who had publicly humiliated me was now claiming I was mentally unfit to control my own money. I called Patricia Chen, who found the letter as amusing as I did. "Mrs. Whitman," she said, "adult children have no legal right to their parents' inheritance. You could give every penny to a charity for stray cats if you wanted to. Your son has no case whatsoever. That evening, I sat in my community garden as the sun set behind the Manhattan skyline. The tomatoes Sophia and I had planted were heavy with fruit, ready for harvest. Around me, families were gathering their vegetables for dinner. Children were chasing fireflies. Teenagers were sharing secrets on wooden benches we'd built together. This was my legacy now. Not the bitter, broken relationship with ungrateful children, but this community of people who had welcomed me as I was. Not the millions of dollars I'd accumulated through careful saving, but the wisdom I'd gained through surviving heartbreak and choosing myself. Mrs. Rodriguez joined me on our favorite bench, bringing 2 cups of her famous café con leche. "You know, mija," she said as we watched the first stars appear, "I've been thinking about what you told me when we first met. About feeling invisible to your own children." I nodded, remembering those dark days when I'd measured my worth entirely through Michael and Nancy's treatment of me. I was so lost then. I thought their love was the only love that mattered. "But look at you now," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "Look at what you've built. Every person in this garden loves you because of who you are, not because of what you can do for them. That's real love, Eleanor. That's the love that lasts." As if summoned by her words, Sophia came running toward us, her face bright with excitement. "Abuela Eleanor, come see! The sunflowers are finally blooming!" She grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the corner of the garden where we'd planted a row of giant sunflowers along the fence. Standing there in the gathering dusk, looking up at flowers that towered over us with faces turned toward the dying light, I felt a profound sense of completion. These flowers had grown from tiny seeds because they'd been planted in good soil, watered with care, and given space to reach toward the sun, just like me. On the first anniversary of changing my will, I received a birthday card from Sophia with a hand-drawn picture of the 2 of us dancing in the garden. Inside, in carefully printed letters, she had written, "Happy birthday to the best abuela in the world. Thank you for teaching me that flowers need love to grow." I cried reading those words, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Michael never called to wish me happy birthday that year. Nancy sent a brief text that felt more like an obligation than a celebration. But my real family, the family I'd chosen and that had chosen me back, threw me a party in the garden complete with a mariachi band and Mrs. Rodriguez's legendary tres leches cake. That night, as I got ready for bed in my apartment filled with flowers and laughter and genuine love, I looked at my reflection and saw someone I barely recognized. The broken woman who had once stood in this same spot, surrounded by pictures of ungrateful children, was gone. In her place stood someone radiant with self-possession and joy. The financial consequences of my decision became clear when Patricia Chen called with updates about my estate planning. The scholarship fund for single mothers had already helped 3 women complete nursing school. The food bank had expanded their services to reach twice as many families. The literacy program had opened a new location specifically for elderly immigrants learning English. "You should know," Patricia said during one of our meetings. "Your son has been making inquiries about contesting your mental fitness. He seems to believe that if he can prove you're not competent, he can override your wishes about the inheritance." The news should have upset me, but instead it felt like confirmation of everything I'd learned about Michael's character. Even now, faced with the natural consequences of his treatment of me, he was looking for ways to manipulate the system rather than examining his own behavior. 2 years have passed since I walked out of Michael's Manhattan apartment, since I chose dignity over desperate love, since I learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. The woman writing these words is not the same person who once shattered a coffee mug and cried on her bedroom floor. I am 75 now, and every morning I wake up grateful for the life I've built from the ashes of the life I thought I wanted. The community garden has expanded to 3 lots, with a waiting list of families who want to participate. The dance class has become a performance group that entertains at local nursing homes and community events. Sophia is 10 now, and she still calls me Abuela Eleanor. She's learning piano and wants to be a doctor like her grandmother Rodriguez was in El Salvador before coming to America. When she talks about her dreams, her eyes shine with the same hope I once saw in Michael's face, but without the hardness that came later. Last month, I received a letter that surprised me. Not from Michael, who has maintained his silence, but from a woman named Jennifer, who identified herself as one of the single mothers who received scholarships from my fund. She had just graduated nursing school and wanted to thank me for making her dream possible. "I don't know what inspired you to help women like me," she wrote, "but I want you to know that your generosity didn't just change my life. It changed my daughter's future, and probably her daughter's future too. Sometimes strangers can be more family than family." Her words reminded me of something I'd learned in these years of rebuilding. Love is not scarce. There is not a limited supply that gets used up if we give it to the wrong people. The more genuine love I offered to my chosen family, the more I had to give. The more respect I demanded for myself, the more I was able to respect others. The legal drama with Michael eventually fizzled out when no lawyer would take his case. As Patricia had predicted, adult children have no right to their parents' money, and my mental competency was clearly evident in my thoughtful, charitable giving and careful financial planning. The man who had once seemed so powerful in his expensive suits and Manhattan apartment had been revealed as what he truly was, a bully who only had power over people who gave it to him. Nancy and I maintain a cordial but distant relationship. She calls on holidays and my birthday. Our conversation's polite but surface level. I think she understands, somewhere deep down, that the old dynamic of taking me for granted is over forever. Sometimes I see something that looks like respect in her eyes when she looks at me now, as if she's finally seeing me as a person rather than just as mom. I never expected this chapter of my life to be my richest, but it has been. Every sunset from my community garden, every laugh in my dance class, every hug from a child who loves me simply because I exist. These moments are worth more than all the years I spent begging for crumbs of affection from people who saw me as an obligation. The $8 million continues to do good work in the world. The scholarship fund has helped 12 women complete nursing school so far. The food bank has served over 50,000 meals. The literacy program has taught hundreds of immigrants the English skills they need to build new lives in America. My money is creating legacies of hope rather than resentment. Sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, I think about Michael, not with anger anymore, but with a sadness that feels clean and finite. I wonder if he ever thinks about the mother who loved him unconditionally, who would have given him anything if he had just treated her with basic human kindness. I wonder if he understands yet that respect cannot be purchased, that love without dignity is not love at all. But mostly I think about the future, about the tomatoes Sophia and I will plant next spring, about the new dance routines Carmen is teaching us, about the women who will benefit from scholarships they don't even know exist yet. I think about the life I'm living now, full of genuine connections and purposeful days, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing your own worth. Looking back, I can see that every betrayal was a gift in disguise. Every moment I felt invisible was preparing me to become someone who could not be unseen. Every time I was treated as worthless was teaching me to recognize my own value. The journey through that darkness was necessary to reach this light. I am not the same woman who once entered her son's cafe in disguise, hoping to catch a glimpse of the love she'd been denied. That woman was seeking validation from people who were incapable of giving it. This woman creates her own validation through acts of service, genuine relationships, and the simple but radical act of treating herself with the kindness she deserves. The inheritance I changed was more than money. It was a complete reorganization of my values, my priorities, my understanding of what family really means. Family is not about blood or obligation or guilt. Family is about people who see you, value you, and choose to build something beautiful together. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in my story, if you're sitting somewhere right now feeling invisible to people who should treasure you, please know this. You are not too old to start over. You are not too set in your ways to change the patterns that have kept you small. You are not required to accept mistreatment from anyone, even your own children. The fear of being alone is powerful, but loneliness in the middle of a crowd of people who don't value you is worse than peaceful solitude. The fear of losing love is natural, but what you might be losing was never really love at all. Real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself. Real love doesn't ask you to buy affection with your dignity. You have one precious life, and it belongs to you. Not to your ungrateful children, not to your demanding relatives, not to anyone who has convinced you that your worth depends on their approval. Your life belongs to you, and you get to decide how to spend the years you have left. I spent 73 years trying to earn love from people who were determined not to give it. I've spent the last 2 years learning to give that love to myself and to people who appreciate it. The difference has been like stepping from a basement into sunlight, like learning to breathe after years of suffocation. Every person who has dismissed you, ignored you, or taken you for granted has been teaching you something valuable. You are stronger than their treatment of you. You are worth more than their opinion of you. You are capable of more love and joy and success than they ever imagined. The community garden blooms every year now, more beautiful than the last. The dance group performs with more confidence and joy each season. The scholarship recipients send updates about their lives and careers, creating ripples of positive change that will continue long after I'm gone. This is what happens when you stop pouring your energy into people who waste it and start investing in people who treasure it. My story is not unusual. All around the world, there are people learning to choose themselves after decades of choosing everyone else first. There are mothers and fathers discovering that their worth was never dependent on their children's approval. There are grandparents realizing that their wisdom and love are valuable even when their families can't see it. You might be one of these people. You might be sitting somewhere right now, feeling the weight of unappreciated sacrifices and unrecognized love. If you are, please hear this. Your story doesn't have to end where mine began. You don't have to wait until you're 73 to start living for yourself. The transformation isn't easy, but it's possible. It starts with small acts of self-respect. It starts with saying no to requests that drain you without giving anything back. It starts with spending time on activities that bring you joy, rather than just serving other people's needs. It starts with looking in the mirror and seeing someone worthy of love and respect, even if that love and respect has to come from you first. Some of the people in your life will not understand your changes. They might accuse you of being selfish or cruel or mentally unstable, like Michael did with me. But people who have benefited from your lack of boundaries have a vested interest in maintaining those boundaries' absence. Their discomfort with your growth is not your responsibility. Others, the people who truly love you, will celebrate your transformation. They will be proud of you for finally treating yourself with the kindness you've always shown others. They will respect your new boundaries because they want you to be happy, not because they want you to be useful. And you will discover, as I did, that there are people in this world who are waiting to love the real you, not the version of yourself that you've contorted to please others, but the authentic person you are when you're not performing for anyone else's approval. These people exist, and they will find you when you stop looking for validation in all the wrong places. The money Michael thought he was entitled to is doing more good in the world than it ever would have in his hands. The love I thought I needed from him has multiplied beyond my wildest imagination in my chosen family. The respect I begged him to give me, I learned to give myself, and it turned out that was the only respect I really needed. But I haven't told you yet about that moment in the cafe, the moment that changed everything. The moment that made me realize just how cruel my son had become and how completely I needed to protect myself from his toxicity. It was a gray November morning, 6 months before I changed my will. I had been wrestling with my decision about whether to continue trying to have a relationship with Michael. Part of me still hoped that somehow, if I could just see him in his element, if I could witness the success I had helped create, maybe I would understand why he had grown so cold. Maybe I could find a way to bridge the gap between us. I spent weeks planning my visit to his cafe. I bought a gray wig from a costume shop in Times Square, practiced walking with a slight stoop, chose clothes that would make me look like any other elderly woman on the streets of New York. The disguise felt theatrical and ridiculous, but it also felt necessary. I needed to see my son when he didn't know I was watching. I needed to understand who he really was when he thought no one who mattered was looking. The cafe was everything the newspaper articles had described. Sleek chrome fixtures, exposed brick walls, the kind of aesthetic that screamed expensive sophistication. The smell of freshly roasted coffee beans filled the air, mixed with the sweet scent of artisanal pastries. Young professionals typed on laptops while sipping drinks that cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week. I ordered a simple coffee and found a small table near the back, close enough to hear conversations, but far enough from the main counter to avoid drawing attention. For 20 minutes, I watched Michael move through his domain like a king surveying his kingdom. He wore an expensive suit that I recognized from photos Nancy had shown me, his hair perfectly styled, his smile practiced and charming for customers who looked like they could afford to become regulars. Then I heard my name. A young woman, maybe in her late 20s, had approached Michael at the counter. She was pretty in that effortless way that money can buy. Perfect teeth, perfectly styled hair, clothes that looked casual, but probably cost more than my rent. "Michael," she said in a voice that carried the confidence of someone who had never doubted her welcome anywhere. "I read that article about your background. So inspiring how you overcame such difficult circumstances." Michael's smile grew wider, and I felt my chest tighten with anticipation. This was it. This was the moment he would acknowledge the woman who had sacrificed everything for his success. This was when he would speak with pride about the mother who had worked multiple jobs to pay for his education, who had pawned her jewelry to cover his medical bills, who had given him every opportunity possible despite impossible odds. "Oh, you mean the single mother thing?" Michael said with a laugh that made my blood run cold. "Yeah, that was rough. My mom was, well, let's just say she wasn't exactly equipped for parenthood. Always working, always stressed, always making me feel guilty about everything we couldn't afford." The young woman made a sympathetic noise, and Michael continued, warming to his topic. "I mean, I get it now. She did her best with what she had. But growing up with someone who's constantly playing the victim gets exhausting. You know? Everything was always about how hard she worked, how much she sacrificed. It was like living with a martyr." My hands began shaking so violently that coffee sloshed over the rim of my cup, staining the white table. But Michael wasn't finished. The floodgates of resentment I'd never known existed had opened, and he was pouring out years of carefully hidden bitterness to this stranger, who nodded along with practiced sympathy. "The guilt trips were the worst part," he said, leaning against the counter with casual confidence. "Every time I wanted something normal that other kids had, it was always, 'Do you know how hard I work for you? Do you know what I sacrifice?' Like it was my fault she had me. Like I asked to be born into that situation." The young woman shook her head with understanding. "That must have been so hard on you. No child should have to carry that burden." "Exactly." Michael's voice carried the excitement of someone finally being understood. "And now she's gotten worse. She's become this needy, clingy woman who expects me to be grateful for the bare minimum. Like, yes, you fed me and kept a roof over my head. That's literally what parents are supposed to do. You don't get a medal for basic survival." I couldn't breathe. The words were hitting me like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. This was what my son really thought of me. This was how he saw the years I had spent pouring every ounce of love and energy into his future. Not as sacrifices made from devotion, but as manipulation tactics from a woman who didn't understand her place. "She keeps trying to insert herself into my life now," Michael continued, completely unaware that the woman he was describing was sitting 30 feet away, dying inside with every word, wanting to visit, wanting to be involved in my business, acting like she's entitled to be part of my success. It's sad, really. She can't accept that I've moved beyond the world she lives in." The young woman glanced around the cafe admiringly. "Well, you've certainly created something amazing here. She should be proud of what you've accomplished." Michael laughed again, that same cold, dismissive sound. "Oh, she is. She's very proud. Embarrassingly proud. She talks about me to anyone who will listen, like my success somehow validates her parenting. It doesn't. If anything, I succeeded despite her, not because of her. She was just there, a constant reminder of everything I wanted to escape." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the polished concrete floor. Several customers looked up from their laptops, but I barely noticed. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to get away from the sound of my son's voice describing me like I was a burden he'd been forced to carry, rather than the woman who had carried him through everything. Outside on the sidewalk, I pulled off the gray wig with shaking hands and leaned against a lamppost, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. People flowed around me like water around a stone, everyone rushing somewhere important while I stood there feeling like my entire world had collapsed. But it wasn't just heartbreak I felt standing there on that busy Manhattan street. It was something else, something I hadn't experienced in years of dealing with Michael's coldness and criticism. It was clarity, pure, crystalline, undeniable clarity about who my son really was and who he had always been. This wasn't new behavior brought on by success or stress or circumstances. This was who Michael was at his core. A man so consumed with his own image that he could rewrite the history of his childhood to make himself look better to strangers. A man so lacking in basic gratitude that he could describe the woman who had given him everything as nothing more than an obligation he'd endured. I walked home to Queens in my regular clothes, carrying that gray wig like evidence of a crime I'd witnessed. The subway ride felt eternal, each stop marking another mile between me and the son I realized I had never really known. He wasn't the grateful but distant child I'd imagined. He wasn't the busy but loving man who simply didn't have time for visits. He was someone who saw my love as manipulation, my sacrifices as guilt trips, my very existence as an embarrassment. That evening, I called Patricia Chen and told her I was ready to finalize my will changes immediately. I didn't need more time to think about it. I didn't need to consider the ramifications or worry about family reactions. I had heard enough to know that my first instinct had been right. Michael didn't deserve my money because Michael had never deserved my devotion. The woman in that cafe had treated me with more respect in 30 minutes than my own son had shown me in 30 years. She had listened to his cruel description of me and responded with sympathy for his situation, never knowing that she was talking to a man who was describing his own mother like she was something disgusting he'd scraped off his shoe. But here's what struck me most as I sat in my apartment that night, finally processing what I'd heard. I felt sorry for Michael, not the pitying sorrow I'd carried for months, worrying about his business troubles and financial stress. I felt sorry for him as a human being, because anyone capable of that level of callousness toward the person who had loved him most was living with an emptiness I couldn't imagine. How hollow must his life be, to need to tear down the woman who had built his foundation? How insecure must he feel about his success, to need to diminish the sacrifices that had made it possible? How lonely must he be, surrounded by people who only knew the version of himself he performed for them, never the truth of where he'd come from or what it had cost to get him there. The young woman in the cafe had been impressed by his story of overcoming difficult circumstances, but she didn't know that those circumstances had been smoothed by a mother who worked herself to exhaustion to make sure he never went without. She admired his success, but she had no idea that every opportunity he'd been given had come at the expense of a woman who now lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens because she'd spent everything on him. Michael had built his identity on being self-made, but he was only self-made if you ignored the woman who had made everything possible. He had convinced himself that his mother's love was a burden rather than a gift, because accepting the gift would mean acknowledging the debt. And Michael, I realized, was not the kind of man who liked to acknowledge debts. That night, for the first time in years, I slept deeply and dreamlessly. I woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since I was young. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I no longer cared how anyone else would react to my decisions. The woman who had spent decades worrying about her son's approval was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood her own worth. The scholarship fund was my favorite part of the will changes. Every time I met with Patricia Chen to review the details, I imagined young single mothers receiving the news that their education would be paid for, that someone believed in their dreams enough to invest in their future. I imagined them graduating nursing school or completing their degrees without the crushing debt I'd watched Michael accumulate, and then expect me to help resolve. These women would never know my name, just like I'd never known the name of the anonymous donor who had once helped me pay for Michael's asthma medication when our insurance fell short. They would just know that someone, somewhere, understood their struggles and wanted to help. That was the kind of legacy I wanted to leave. Anonymous kindness rather than entitled expectation. The food bank was an easy choice too. I'd volunteered there briefly in my 50s, before Michael's demands on my time and energy made it impossible to maintain outside commitments. I remembered the faces of families who came in looking embarrassed but desperate. The way parents tried to explain to their children why they couldn't choose their favorite cereal or why they had to be grateful for whatever was available. Michael had never known that kind of hunger. I'd made sure of it, sometimes going without dinner myself to make sure he had enough to eat. But he'd never known about those sacrifices, and based on what I'd heard in the cafe, he wouldn't have cared if he had. In his mind, keeping him fed was just basic parenting, nothing worthy of acknowledgement or gratitude. The literacy program was perhaps the most personal choice of all. I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, who had come to America speaking no English and had spent years struggling to communicate with teachers, doctors, and employers. I thought about all the elderly immigrants in our neighborhood who were isolated by language barriers, who had so much wisdom and life experience to share but couldn't find the words to share it. Michael had complained throughout high school about having to help me tutor the neighborhood kids, rolling his eyes at the accents of their parents and making sarcastic comments about their grammar mistakes. Even then, he'd shown signs of the elitist attitude that would eventually make him ashamed of his own background. Even then, he'd been building walls between himself and the community that had helped raise him. But the changes in my daily life were the most dramatic part of my transformation. For the first time in decades, I was living for myself rather than for the approval of ungrateful children. The community garden gave me a sense of purpose that didn't depend on anyone else's recognition. The dance classes filled my evenings with joy instead of lonely waiting by the phone. Carmen, our dance instructor, had become a real friend. She was 78 years old, had been widowed for 15 years, and radiated the kind of confidence I'd never associated with women our age. "Honey," she told me after I'd been coming to class for 6 months, "you move like someone who's finally stopped apologizing for taking up space." She was right. I had spent so many years making myself smaller, quieter, less demanding, hoping that somehow my modest presence would be more acceptable to my children. I'd trained myself to need less, want less, expect less, until I'd become practically invisible. The dance floor was where I learned to take up space again, to move with intention and joy, to exist fully in my own body without shame or apology. Sophia had become more than Mrs. Rodriguez's granddaughter. She had become the child I'd never had, someone who loved me unconditionally, who ran to me with excitement about her day, who asked for advice and actually listened to the answers. When she hugged me, there was no calculation behind it, no hidden agenda. She hugged me because she loved me, simply and completely. "Abuela Eleanor," she said one afternoon as we were harvesting peppers in the garden, "my friend Maria says her grandmother in Mexico used to be very sad because her children never visited. But then she started taking care of all the neighborhood kids, and now she's happy all the time. Is that what happened to you?" The question was so innocent and so perceptive that it took my breath away. "Something like that, Misha," I said, kneeling down to her eye level. "Sometimes the family you choose is more important than the family you're born with." Sophia nodded seriously, then brightened. "That means you chose us, right? You chose to be our abuela?" When I confirmed that yes, I had chosen them, her smile was so radiant it made me want to weep with gratitude for this child who understood love better than my own grown son ever had. The community I'd found in Queens was everything Michael's Manhattan world was not. It was authentic instead of performative, generous instead of transactional, inclusive instead of exclusive. People knew each other's stories, celebrated each other's successes, and helped each other through difficulties without keeping score. When Mr. Chan's wife went into the hospital for surgery, the whole block organized meal deliveries. When the Ramirez family lost their apartment in a building fire, we collected clothes and furniture and helped them find a new place. When Mrs. Patterson's grandson was deployed overseas, we made sure she wasn't alone on the holidays. This was what real community looked like. People taking care of each other because it was the right thing to do, not because they expected something in return. Michael had never understood this kind of connection. Even as a child, he'd been calculating about friendships, always assessing what other people could do for him, rather than what he could contribute to their lives. I'd watched him drop friends the moment they couldn't help advance his goals, always moving toward people with more money, more connections, more social status. I used to tell myself that this was just ambition, that it was natural for a young man to want to improve his circumstances. But listen to him talk about me in that cafe. I realized it was something darker. It was an inability to value people for their intrinsic worth, rather than their utility to him. I was no longer useful for his image, so I had been discarded like everything else he'd outgrown. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to escape what he saw as the embarrassment of his humble beginnings, Michael had become someone truly embarrassing, a man without loyalty, gratitude, or genuine connection to anyone. His expensive clothes and Manhattan apartment couldn't hide the poverty of his character, the emptiness where his heart should have been. Meanwhile, I was discovering riches I'd never known existed. The satisfaction of watching vegetables grow from seeds we'd planted together. The joy of learning new dance steps and feeling my body respond with grace and strength. The peace of falling asleep surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. These were the real treasures, the ones that couldn't be bought or borrowed or stolen. Nancy's occasional check-ins became less frequent, as it became clear that I wasn't going to change my mind about the inheritance or start begging for reconciliation with Michael. She'd call on holidays and make polite conversation about the weather and her work. But the old dynamic was gone. She couldn't guilt me anymore because I was no longer susceptible to guilt about putting my own well-being first. "You seem different, Mom," she said during one of our brief phone calls. Distant. Like you don't care about family anymore. The accusation was familiar. The same attempt to make me feel selfish for having boundaries that both my children had perfected over the years. "I care about family more than ever," I replied calmly. "I just have a different definition of what family means now. It means people who treat each other with respect and kindness, people who show up for each other, people who don't take love for granted." The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Nancy said, "You know Michael is struggling, right? The business failure, the divorce proceedings, the stress. He could use support from his family right now." Michael was getting divorced. This was the first I'd heard of it, and it explained some of his recent desperation for money. But instead of feeling the old urge to rush to his rescue, I felt only a distant sadness for all the relationships he'd damaged through his inability to truly connect with another human being. "I'm sure he's going through a difficult time," I said. "Failure and loss are part of life. They're opportunities to learn important lessons about what really matters. I won't interfere with those lessons by bailing him out of the consequences of his choices." After I hung up, I sat in my small living room thinking about the man Michael was becoming, and the man he might have been if I'd taught him better boundaries from the beginning, if I'd required him to show gratitude instead of accepting his entitlement, if I'd demanded respect instead of settling for tolerance, if I'd modeled self-worth instead of demonstrating that love meant accepting mistreatment. But those regrets belonged to the past, and I was finally living in the present. Tonight, Carmen was teaching us a new routine to perform at the Senior Center's Spring Festival. Tomorrow, Sophia and I were planting the summer garden, adding herbs this year so families could take home fresh cilantro and basil with their vegetables. Next week, I was interviewing candidates for the latest round of nursing school scholarships, meeting young women whose determination reminded me of my younger self. This was my life now, full of purpose, surrounded by genuine love, focused on creating positive change in the world, rather than begging for scraps of attention from people who couldn't see my value. I was no longer the woman who needed her son's approval to feel worthy. I was someone who had found her own worth and was using it to lift up others. The $8 million would keep working long after I was gone, creating opportunities for people who deserved them, feeding families who needed help, teaching skills that would last generations. It would be a legacy of hope instead of resentment, of empowerment instead of dependency, of love freely given rather than desperately sought. And somewhere in Manhattan, my son was learning the hardest lesson of all, that charm and manipulation can only take you so far before the emptiness at the center of your life becomes impossible to ignore. That success built on other people's sacrifices is hollow when you refuse to acknowledge those sacrifices. that burning bridges to your past will eventually leave you stranded on an island of your own making. I hoped, for his sake more than mine, that he would find his way back to the values I'd tried to teach him when he was young, that he would remember the mother who had loved him unconditionally and realize what he had thrown away, that he would learn to treat people with kindness and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than utility. But whether he learned those lessons or not was no longer my responsibility. I had done my part by raising him with every advantage I could provide. The rest was up to him. Tonight, as I finish writing this story, I can hear music and laughter from the courtyard below my apartment. It's Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson's quinceañera, and the whole neighborhood has been invited. I'll go down soon, wearing my dancing shoes and my yellow dress, to celebrate with people who see me as a blessing in their lives rather than a burden. This is what the other side of heartbreak looks like. This is what happens when you choose dignity over desperation, when you choose authentic connections over obligatory relationships, when you choose to live your own life instead of trying to earn a place in someone else's. Have you ever lived through something like what I've shared with you tonight? Have you ever felt invisible to the very people you've sacrificed everything for? Have you ever wondered if you're asking too much when all you want is basic respect and kindness? Please share your story in the comments below. Tell me about your journey towards self-respect, or about the relationships that have drained your spirit, or about the moment you decided you deserved better. Your story matters as much as mine does, and someone else who needs to hear it might be reading these comments right now. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships and boundaries and worth, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Together, we can create a community of people who refuse to settle for being treated poorly by anyone, even family. Together, we can support each other in the radical act of choosing ourselves. Your life is not over. Your story is not finished. The best chapters might still be waiting to be written, and they start the moment you decide you deserve better than what you've been accepting. The moment you stop begging for love and start believing you're worthy of it simply because you exist. The woman who entered that cafe in disguise, desperate for any sign of her son's affection, is gone forever. In her place stands someone who knows that love without respect is not love at all, that family without kindness is not family at all, that a life lived entirely for others is not a life at all. I am 75 years old, and I am finally living. The garden is blooming. The dance floor is calling. The future is bright with possibility, and I am no longer invisible to the person whose opinion matters most, myself.